Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our post-legislative session wrap-up with Andrew Griffin, who is the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs with the Maryland Chamber of Commerce. The Maryland Chamber is an outstanding partner of the Central Maryland Chamber year-round, but especially during the General Assembly session, and we greatly appreciate their support and partnership as we work on business issues together. I want to recognize a few special guests we have with us today who are either in the room or will be joining us soon. First is Maryland State Senator Jim Rosapep. Then we have from the Maryland House of Delegates, Delegate Joseline Pena-Melnick, who I think will be joining us shortly. And Jessica Cook from the office of U.S. Senator Ben Cardin will be joining us as well. And did I miss anyone who is here on behalf of an elected official? No? Okay. Well, again, thank you for joining us. And we will have Q&A at the end of the program, so feel free to type your questions in the chat box, or a little later in the program, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your questions live once we get to the Q&A portion of the program. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today's program. Andrew Griffin is the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs at the Maryland Chamber and leads advocacy efforts on behalf of the 6,400 plus members of the Chamber before the Maryland General Assembly and at the federal level. He develops, leads, and executes the legislative strategy of the organization and maintains the Chamber's positive working relationships with key elected officials and members of the administration to build a better understanding of and appreciation for business issues. Andrew joined the Chamber in 2019. Andrew is a Maryland native and has worked on multiple local, state, and federal political campaigns. Prior to joining the Chamber, he was the Director of Advocacy for the University of Maryland College Park. In that role, Andrew managed the grassroots outreach support of the most pressing policy and budgetary issues that impact the state's flagship university. Andrew also served in Governor Hogan's administration, both in the Appointments Office, where he oversaw gubernatorial appointments to over 500 state boards and commissions, and is Assistant Director of Government Affairs at the Maryland Department of Agriculture. Andrew is an avid outdoorsman and received his master's and bachelor's degrees from the University of Maryland College Park. He currently lives in Annapolis with his wife, young son, and Boykin Spaniel named Huck. So, long introduction, but you're very accomplished. We're so grateful to have you here with us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Christy. You didn't have to read a small novel for me. You could have just said, "This is Andrew." But I appreciate it as always. Christy, thank you for the invitation into the Central Maryland Chamber. Like Christy said, what we do at the Maryland Chamber certainly wouldn't be possible without our partnerships with the county, local, and regional chambers. Certainly the Central Maryland Chamber, you all are an active group. I appreciate it. It's not the first time I have spoken to you all. I see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of friendly faces. And so I know we're going to kind of I'll probably talk a lot, which I don't like to do. And so if you have a question or a comment, and certainly Senator Rosapep or anyone else that is on, if you have a question or comment, please feel free to chime in. I want this to be open and more of a dialogue than it is just me talking about how I read things. And so with that, I'll kind of just get started. I think to start off, I'll do two things. One, I'll highlight what the Maryland Chamber's kind of legislative priorities were going into the session, because I think it's important sometimes to kind of like reflect on what was important to us going into it and then kind of see where we end up. And then certainly I think this session with the election and so many kind of new faces, I think that's important to keep in mind as well. And so I'll just say, one, going into the session, the Maryland Chamber was really focused on four like big priority issues. I think one was continuing to work on the paid leave program that we know passed in the 22 session. And there was work to be done there, which I'll talk about. Two, we had been pushing a broadband, a sales tax bill for telecommunications equipment to kind of help make sure every dollar being used, every dollar available for broadband was going to roll out. Three, we have been focused on really since COVID, increasing childcare availability. It's an issue we continue to hear from employers. And so that's one we focused on. And then fourth, it's kind of like had been or seems to be maybe the most overused buzzword in Annapolis, and that's like dealing with workforce development. And I think as we see kind of the labor market continuing to change as we're going through several iterations of it, it's a never-changing issue. So those are kind of top priorities moving in. I think the other thing we want to keep in mind, like I mentioned, is the 23 session was a lot of new, right? We had a lot of new faces, new governor, new comptroller, new attorney general, certainly a lot of new members of the legislature, which I'm sure Senator Rosapep can speak to. And because of that, the committees, both in the House and the Senate, looked very different. And so going in, I think there was a lot of learning and figuring each other out and getting to kind of know the flow of things. I think certainly from the governor and the legislature that was there, but in the 10 years that I've worked here in Annapolis, just switching someone from committee A to committee B when they don't have a ton of experience in that issue area, there's a learning curve there. And so I think we did a lot of that. Because of that, we saw a lot of pieces of legislation that were introduced. We just kind of saw the process take a little longer than maybe that we're accustomed to in Annapolis, and things kind of getting off the ground. And so I think all that is really important. Plus a handful of other policy issues that we knew were going to kind of be the top level items for legislative leadership and for the General Assembly. Those certainly cannabis. Building a regulatory framework for cannabis, and I'll talk a little bit about that more specifically. Senate Bill 1 and general gun control measures, right? We saw a lot of conversations about that. That dominated a lot of conversation. And certainly the issues around the sexual abuse issue and the release of the Attorney General's report on abuse in the Catholic Church dominated a lot of airtime, certainly. And then I think the other big one, certainly from the chamber's perspective, I think that we knew was going to be kind of a theme, but we really saw play out was kind of this push from the new Attorney General for expanded resources, expanded authority, which we knew because he had been open to saying that he was going to do it. But certainly, I think we probably engaged on more bills related to the Attorney General's office this year than we have in the past 4.5 years that I've been here. And so I think that was a theme that kind of popped up. So I think getting into specifics beyond that, I'll start off with the minimum wage bill, right? I think most of you kind of know, kind of coming out of a promise of Governor Moore on the campaign trail, we knew that there was going to be a bill to raise or fast track the minimum wage. What that looked like, we weren't totally sure. We kind of heading into session knew he wanted to get to 15 probably sooner than what we were already going to go when we were going to get there. We had heard rumblings that certainly he wanted to attach the minimum wage increase to some level of inflation. It obviously panning out being to CPI. And so at the state chamber, we were getting, to be honest with you, really mixed kind of feedback from the business community on the minimum wage, if I can be frank. Certainly, the way I characterize it is some of the loudest voices in the room, typically among industries, among certain areas of the state, all minimum wage. They weren't necessarily, I wouldn't say they weren't in my ear as upset as they typically have been in other discussions around raising the minimum wage in the past. And I think that is a reflection of, and I want to be, this does not hold true for all businesses, right? Certainly small businesses and businesses in other areas of the state are going to feel some kind of a crunch. But I think by and large, those individuals that typically are really focused on the minimum wage or have workers around the minimum wage, because of the competitive marketplace, tend to already be at the 15 or potentially above. And so I think we saw that play out among our membership, among kind of the typical industries that the topic wasn't as hot among our membership as we typically have seen. And so I think our engagement on the issue reflected that. We worked very well with the governor's office. I think we worked really well with the General Assembly in kind of making sure that the voices of those who were concerned about it were articulated well. But we wanted to make sure that, certainly the governor was able to kind of achieve what the promise he had made, and also by balancing what the impact of the business community was going to be. And I think we saw that play out in the final bill, being the state is going to go to 15. It's going to go to 15 January of 24. And I think the most worrisome component of that bill was the attachment to CPI. It was removed. And I think certainly from our standpoint, we were happy to see that. But I think there's an expectation that we maybe see that come back in the future. I've kind of heard that as the attachment to CPI, maybe a push that we continue to see. But I think where we are, listen, certainly not every business is happy about it, but I think it's not as contentious as we typically have seen. And so in that sense, I think that minimum wage was kind of a low level issue for us this session. Any questions on the minimum wage bill? I'll kind of just do broad questions as we go along so that it's not just me talking ad nauseum. I don't know that there's a ton of surprise with the minimum wage bill. I think everything was kind of well covered. So Scott, it's a great question. In 2019, when the minimum wage was raised, the phase-in was implemented, right? And the General Assembly kind of bifurcated the minimum wage to this 15 or more and then 15 or less. That's a concern that we had this year, and we talked about a lot. I think the pushback, I think, from the General Assembly was continuing on this bifurcated track of smaller businesses continuing to lag, when really the push from the governor was he wanted everybody at 15. And so certainly I think the small businesses, they are seeing the under 15. They're going to see a much larger increase in their labor costs than if you were 15 or over. I think my rough back of the envelope calculation, if everyone was a minimum wage employee, I think an under 15 is going to see an extra 5% increase in labor cost getting to that 15 compared to where they were. And so there is a little bit of crunch there. But I think that was just an issue that the General Assembly just didn't want to continue to delay. And so everybody, regardless of size, is going to be at 15 on January 1 of 24. All right, if no other questions of minimum wage, I'll continue to move on. I think the other big ticket item for us, like I mentioned, was continuation of the paid leave discussion. And we know last year in the 22 session, the General Assembly passed family and medical leave insurance program. Passed the program really with, I wouldn't say questions, but the legislation kind of in some areas still left a lot to be desired, and there were things that needed to be cleaned up. There was, still just a lot of questions in some areas and ambiguity and definitions that need to be cleaned up. And so kind of going into this session, there was, in the interim, there was some work, albeit several different groups kind of came up with their version of what they thought would be a cleanup bill. And so this session, we saw a bill come in to really, I'm going to call it a cleanup bill, and that is not to say that the original version was too messy, but there were just definitions and because of the election and certainly the change in administration, the Department of Labor needed a little bit more time to get their act together, for a better word, right? When you have some people coming in and taking over. And so I think the three things to note of the paid leave bill that was passed this year is that, one, the program is going to be delayed by a year. That includes both contributions from employees and employers, as well as when benefits can be taken. So contributions were to have begun in October of this year, 2023, right? So that's when an employer and employee would start contributing their share. That's being pushed back to October of 24. And then when someone can apply for that benefit was going to be January of 2025. That is now being pushed back to January of 2026. So there's a 15-month pay in time or whatever, 16-month pay in time to boost the fund. I think one, that's important. Two, the other major change was the General Assembly decided to go ahead and put the split, so the cost to be shared between the employer in the legislation. That is going to be a 50-50 split. What is being split, the rate, is yet to be determined by the Department of Labor. However, the legislation this year did put in a cap, so the contribution will never be above 1.2% of the average weekly wage of that individual. And so at maximum, what would be split would be 1.2%, 50% paid by the employee, 50% paid by the employer. That's up to the Social Security wage base. And then at that point, the contributions phase out. And so I think that's the second major issue that was kind of worked out in the legislation this year. And then third, we've continued to hear issues from the business community about concurrence. And to be honest, this is, we weren't able to get all the kinks, all the wrinkles ironed out. And this is an issue, particularly for the smaller business community, that's going to become a challenge. The legislation as it currently stands says that an employer may not require an employee to take the paid leave program concurrently with certain types of leave, and that leave is vacation leave, other type of employer-sponsored leave. I think where the rub becomes is that for those of you that are in small businesses, many times small businesses only offer one bucket of leave, period, right? And so that may be sick leave, vacation leave, any other type of leave that you may get just goes into one bucket, and it's all just called your paid time off bucket. And so unlike, let's say, a larger company, which may offer 2 weeks vacation, you get X number of days sick per year, you get, maybe they already had a 2-week or 4-week parental leave policy on the books. So the legislation segregates out different kinds of leave and says what can and cannot run concurrently. So if you're a small employer and you only have one bucket, and that bucket is just paid time off, which is included for everything, you will not be able to make your employee take that leave concurrently with the paid leave program. However, a bigger company, for example, which may segregate out their leave, they can require their employee to take that leave concurrently with parental leave, it's already on the books, sick leave, all because they simply break it out. And so we kind of see an instance, it's a funny instance, but one where smaller businesses typically, who typically have leave built this way, potentially could be disadvantaged when it comes to the amount of time that employees are out of the workforce. And so we worked a lot on concurrence. Some things were cleaned up. Some small things still kind of exist, which that being one of them. I think the one that we were able to clean up was, and I know that this is all like highly technical and the eyes kind of glaze over a little bit. So if you have questions, please ask them. I want to make sure people are clear. This program is going to kick in, right, in a year. People are going to start making payments. So it's really important that you guys kind of understand how this works. Concurrence around an employee who may be FMLA eligible, right? So that's what someone who 50 employees or more, their employees are FMLA eligible. If they were to decide to take FMLA and not take their paid leave benefit, we ironed out the issue that you couldn't stack your 8 weeks FMLA, couldn't have your 8 weeks FMLA unpaid, and then put your 12 weeks family benefit on top of that, potentially to be out for 20 weeks. And so if they decide to take the unpaid FMLA benefit, that will run against their paid leave time. And so they will exhaust some of that as well. So that is another issue that was kind of ironed out. So those are the three big ones: there's concurrence, a delay, and then contribution split and cap, the big items coming out of that. So the question to short-term disability. There's a big question around this. I think you're going to see one of two things happen. And this is just kind of me prognosticating. So give me a second. I think you'll see some employers drop their short-term disability plans. That will probably happen among employers who don't have any kind of parental leave on the books at all, and maybe financially can't offer generous packages. And so there's no incentive to carry an additional coverage when this exists. And so you will probably see some people do away with their short-term disability. Or let's say you're a medium-sized company who offers, pretty decent benefits as it is, but maybe your benefits are not quite generous enough to be exempt from the state program. I think what you will see is companies begin to go out and get essentially what is gap insurance. And I know that private insurers are currently building programs here in Maryland to offer that need. Short and long-term disability likely will fill some of that in some instances. In a combination of other benefits that you offer may help get you to a place in which, if you're offering benefits as good or better than what the state requires, you can be exempt from the program. And I think that that's probably what you'll see. But for the smaller companies who are just carrying short or long-term disability, I would expect a lot of that to go away, to be honest, because you would essentially be double paying and carrying double coverage. So any other questions with paid leave? I know it is dense, and it is one that we will continue to talk about. So I think the next step for paid leave is what we can expect this summer or by the fall, is the Department of Labor is going to come back and make the announcement of what the percent contribution will be of pay. And I think early indications from them and some of the studies they're doing is we should expect something probably between the 0.8 and 0.9% range for contribution level. So lower than I think what we had kind of initially thought, which is a good thing. All right, I'm quickly going to breeze over just the tax topic. So typically, in any legislative session, I spend a lot of time talking about taxes because that is just the nature of the legislature at some points in time. I think it's important to remember that when we went into this session, the general feeling was that the budget is healthy. There is not a need for revenue. Taxes and tax increases, particularly for us looking at businesses, not necessarily on the table. I think what we saw pan out right in the budget process is that, hey, there was a budget write down, and I think as we're looking towards the future, that conversation is maybe slightly different than what we thought going into the 23 session. But most of the annual items that we see come in on the tax front, we saw a few of them, but there really was no significant call for revenue raising this session. And so just broadly speaking, I will say on the tax front is one we kind of got a little bit of a reprieve. I will say probably one of the main priorities of the chamber, we were pushing a sales tax exemption for certain telecommunications equipment. This is going back to kind of that broadband push. Unfortunately, that bill, it did pass. It was amended to be a study to look at this in the future. But I think, listen, it was just a victim of, like I said, the budget write down. And certainly when you have to trim the budget a little bit, sales tax exemptions go by the wayside, which is to be expected. And I think that certainly is just political reality. And I'm going to do unemployment insurance, and I'm going to talk about unemployment insurance. There were not big unemployment insurance bills did not pass this session. I think what is important to know is next session or the one after, we're going to be having a very real conversation about an unemployment insurance program overhaul in Maryland. And I think rightfully so, it's coming out of certainly what we experienced during COVID, which for a variety of reasons and kind of the confluence of a lot of different things. The unemployment insurance program in Maryland really just did not work the way it is intended, or the way that it should have, or the way that both employees and employers needed it to work, right? And so there's a very real discussion to be had as to how do we make sure it is adequately funded, how do we make sure that the program works well, and how do we make sure it stays modern as we move forward. We did see a really large unemployment insurance bill this year, an omnibus bill, with a lot of new ideas in it, some ideas that came out of a report done, I guess a year and a half ago now, some ideas from other states, some novel ideas about, certainly requiring companies, investing companies to carry bonds to come in and make investments in the state. And so I think there's a very long conversation to have. But I think what's important to note is that as we're looking forward to next session or the session after, unemployment insurance is going to be kind of at the top of that list. I think the unfortunate reality is that any major change that's happened to the unemployment insurance program is going to lead to increased tax payments from the business community, right? Unemployment insurance is entirely funded by the business community. And so I think that is just likely going to be the outcome. Certainly, if we're going to raise benefits to keep up with inflation, if we're going to make sure that the trust fund stays healthy, that money only comes from the employer. So I think that's kind of what everyone needs to expect. I think the last thing I'll touch on is cannabis, and then I'll pause and I'll take questions or anything else specifically you guys want to hear about. Certainly for all of those of you who voted in the last election, you know that cannabis was on the ballot, legalization of adult use, and July 1, right? It's July 1. It becomes legal beagle. And so I think the General Assembly was kind of under pressure, right? They had to pass really some kind of a regulatory structure this session. And so certainly a lot of people put in a lot of time, a lot of hours worth of work into what we saw. Certainly came in as a 90-page bill. Jokingly, I think I can say that there are 90 pages worth of amendments, but I don't know if it was quite 90 pages worth of amendments, but it was a lot. And I think from the state chamber's view, we were really focused on a really narrow issue with legalization of cannabis. And it's one that certainly I continue to hear from a variety of different industries for a variety of different reasons. And everyone's concern is really valid, depending on how you're looking at it, where you're looking at it from. But I think we were really focused in on, right, maintaining the employer's rights, what I say broadly, maintaining an employer's right to ensure a safe workplace, ensure a drug-free workplace for certainly themselves, their customers, and their employees. And so I think that was really our focus. And so there was kind of like a 3-alarm fire at some point during the session when the bill came in with some pretty strong protective immunity language in it for employers. That was removed. And then through some conversation, really the feedback that we have gotten from, certainly intent of the legislature, opinion of the Attorney General, is that things should continue to go on for employers as they are currently. And so the things that you have at your disposal for your drug-free workplace policies, maybe you utilize testing in your hiring practices, maybe you utilize random drug testing, you're a manufacturer, to make sure someone's not under the influence while they come in and let's say they're working on a manufacturing line. All of that is going to remain. Your ability to take employment action as a result of a drug test, all of that is going to remain. Now, cannabis is slightly different than, let's say, opioids or alcohol, in that the testing technology is not quite where we need it to be. But despite that, you still have access to that and to those protocols. And I think that at this point is the best that the business community can be asking for. And that's where we currently stand. So Senator Rosebeth, I saw you come off. I don't know if you had something you want to add to that.
No, I had to take a phone call. I appreciate
no
it.
problem.
I don't even know what you're talking about now. Sorry.
Talking about cannabis. It's okay.
No, I know very little about cannabis.
Yeah. And so where we sit on that, and I know that has been the concern, and certainly each industry area, right, has their own individual concern. Let's say you work in the transportation sector, you're going to continue to be covered under federal law for that, right? Let's say you're a government contractor, a federal contractor, you're going to continue to be covered under federal law. And so I think things should continue and will continue as you currently know it. So I will pause there on cannabis, and I will take questions that I can answer. It's a very large bill, so if you ask me something about, I don't know, the tax structure, I probably can't answer that. But all right, I think the only other thing that I want to highlight that we did see this session that we will continue to see in the future, actually two points. One, I think there will continue to be a push around retirement income areas. Certainly seeing some retirement relief in the state. I think that is one that the state is we're feeling a lot of pressure on, certainly when it comes to business attraction and economic development. I think certainly the governor trying to deliver some movement on that for military retirees is a great signal. I think we continue to see him push for that. We will continue to work on it. I think that's an issue that we'll continue to see come back. And then the other one that I will touch on briefly is dealing with data privacy. So, more and more businesses of all sizes, they're beginning to deal in a collection of, storage, and use of people's data. This is an issue that we have talked about for the last 4, 5, 6 years. I think through a lot of, through the political machination, I think we're getting to a point that in the next session, if not the session after, we can expect the state to probably pass a pretty large data privacy bill, which is going to set parameters around how you, as private industry, if you're collecting individuals' data, but how you are collecting it, how you are storing it, what you are doing with that data. And I certainly don't think that I have yet to have anybody come to me and say that they want, unfettered use of someone's data. And I think certainly most businesses are trying to do the right thing. But I think if that's not something that you pay attention to often as part of, let's say, your business operation, if you're doing it, I think it's something that you're going to have to begin to pay attention to. And I hope you would continue to engage in the debate. We have and will continue to work on it. But I would say, if not next session, certainly the one after. But I would probably say we'll see a large omnibus type data privacy bill pass here in Maryland, like we have seen in some other states. Certainly, we're seeing more states continue to do it. And so I would expect that from us. So I will pause there. I will take questions on anything I talked about or anything else that I may be able to answer. And if not, I can just hang out and talk about stuff. I think overall, this session was a unique one because it was so much of kind of like a feeling each other out type scenario. We didn't see a lot of the bad stuff that we typically would complain about, and we got some good things in the meantime. So overall, listen, I think it was a good session for the business community. It's certainly how I would characterize it.
Can I make a suggestion, Christy? Maybe just open up to questions more generally, not about the stuff we've gone over, but are there any particular questions you all have, either about issues that you're particularly concerned about or things related to your business, or about anything related to the legislature and the governor?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, we're open to all types of questions. I know. How about the push to green energy and
Mhm.
where all that wound up? It was being discussed throughout session.
Yeah, I think our focus really, we spent a lot of time on the I'll use some general terms you guys are probably familiar of. There's the state adopted what we call California cars regulation as a result of kind of some our attachment to California's Clean Air Act. Um, we kind of saw an extension of that dealing with medium and heavy duty vehicles, which we were engaged in. I think what we saw is a lot of the incentive around, let's say, going to electric vehicles, or I'm sorry, a lot of the mandate around electric vehicles was switched really to an incentive. And so what we're seeing is the state taking a different approach and saying, hey, how can we incent private industry to move towards electric vehicles, which certainly we're very supportive of. And so I think on that front, we were kind of happy to see what had passed. With and I'm now trying to, the Climate Solutions Now Act. It took me a second to think of the name of the Climate Solutions Now Act from 2 sessions ago. I think was such a large bill that really broadly speaking, as we're kind of looking at energy policy in the state, I think this session was a little bit of an exhale from what they did in 22. Certainly with a new administration coming in and new individuals looking at these issues from inside state agencies. I think everyone just kind of needs to figure out what the next step is before we see the continuation of that. But on the electric vehicle front, I think we were happy with where we ended up, having more of an incentive bill than a mandate bill.
Maybe I could jump in on that too. There are a couple different aspects. I mean, one thing that I think is clear is that the politics of renewable energy and climate change, in my view, has really sort of switched pretty substantially with the change in administration and simply with the passage of time and with the fact that the federal government did the big infrastructure package and the big green package in 2021 and 2022. And now you have folks at the Public Service Commission who are very much committed to the fighting climate change agenda. And you have Paul Pinsky, former Senator Paul Pinsky, who was the author of the Climate Change Act, whatever it was called, the Climate Change Action Bill, is now the director of the State Energy Administration. And so I think you're going to see increasing momentum around all aspects related to dealing with climate change over the next few years. Secondly, because of the move to electric cars and basically needing much more demand for electricity, shifting off other forms of generation, we got to scale up our production of energy. And you probably know, did the bill on offshore wind, did that ended up getting passed and signed?
It did, yes.
Gotcha. Well, that's a big deal because we got way behind in offshore wind. The wind was still blowing, but we weren't using it to make electricity. And so this legislation is a big deal to get back on track with wind energy, which is important from the point of view of fighting climate change, but is also important from the point of view of just generating more electricity. One of the effects of switching to electric cars, and this is something that I'm a little closer to, as Vice Chair of Budget and Tax and on the subcommittee dealing with transportation, is we're going to have to, over the next couple of years, rejigger our financing of transportation. I mean, we're not investing enough in transportation, as you can see if you live or work in Central Maryland. And secondly, the gas tax is essentially stabilizing and going to go down as a revenue source for the Transportation Trust Fund. So we also passed legislation to set up a commission to really look at the financing of transportation big picture. So I expect that commission will be working over the next year or 2 or 3. And during this term, it'll come back with some big recommendations about how to finance all aspects of transportation going forward.
Yeah, Senator Rosepep, I would continue to echo. Certainly, Transportation Trust Fund issues is one we continue to hear a lot from members of the Maryland Chamber in finding a sustainable funding source,
Yep.
a sustainable funding solution for that. Because what we currently have, and certainly, on budget and tax, kind of the gains of moving money from point A to point B, right, from the general fund and the trust fund is not, I think it's just not what, just not a sustainable situation I think that the state wants to be in. So.
Right.
Okay, thank you so much, Senator. I did get one question directly, and I know, Andrew, you may not feel qualified to answer this, but it's something we're hearing about constantly is Maryland Saves.
Mhm.
All of our businesses are really confused. It doesn't seem like the program's really ironed out. There's not a lot of communication. People are receiving strange things. Like, I'll use us as an example. We had declined to participate because we're doing another plan, and then last week we got a letter asking for our money for the contributions to Maryland Saves. So it just seems a little chaotic still, and people are kind of confused. Do you know of any updates with where that's going? And
I don't know that I have substantial updates. Obviously, I know Senator Rosepep, you had a bill around Maryland Saves in certainly helping to help the Maryland Saves program better connect with businesses.
Right.
I will say, Christy, probably to your point, and to if anyone else here has a question about Maryland Saves, I will say it is a small staff at Maryland Saves. That said, I think Glenn Simmons punches well above his weight when it comes to answering questions and ironing out issues that you may have. And so I would encourage you to reach out to Glenn directly. And I'm sure he will be able to answer the question or walk you through the process. I know he has been great with us and the questions that we've had. And so in the feedback that I have gotten, to be honest, among our small members is kind of that's like anything else. Once you kind of figure out how to get signed up for something, or in Chris, let's say your case, opt out of it, it becomes a simple process. And I know most of the people that are our members who are participating, if they're enrolled, they seem to like it. So
yeah, we did have a webinar with Glenn, and he was terrific and very open to giving us all his direct phone number and very, very helpful. I think some of the members just feel like it was kind of rolled out without a real plan in place, and people were hearing about it after the deadline to enroll and some things like that. So, yeah, maybe we'll have a follow-up webinar with him just to give some updates and answer questions.
Could I dig in on that one?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I was the sponsor of the original legislation creating Maryland Saves, and I'm on the board of Maryland Saves. So I'm curious to get a little more nuance on what are the complaints. You gave the example of, employees have to opt out. Businesses have to opt in. So I don't quite understand how even your chamber situation got that way.
Right. All of our employees have opted out.
But they can only opt out if you've opted in. It's voluntary to the employer.
So if we have another plan, we don't have to participate in Maryland Saves.
That's correct.
I think what happened originally, and this goes back a while, is we may have signed up originally and opted in, and then we had to opt out because we have another program we're working with. So then we had to all go in and decline it, but I think they're still treating us like we had opted in.
I see. So then you change your mind. You want to pull out. Okay.
Yeah, and that's just our specific situation.
Are there any folks on the call who've had any problems with Maryland Saves?
Yeah.
Don't all speak at once.
Well, some of our members have said they never ever received anything about it, and they didn't do either opt in or opt out because they hadn't gotten anything yet.
Oh, I'm sure that's true.
Yeah.
And that's what the legislation that I sponsored this session was designed to help with. Is Maryland Saves has had a hell of a time, pardon my French, getting a good list of businesses because the data at SDAT is not terrific.
Gotcha.
And so what the legislation does is it allows them to get information, not about tax information, but just information of name, rank, and serial number from the controller's office, which SDAT and the controller's office think is a much better source of data for small businesses. So that they knew that from the beginning, and they didn't want to hold back on the rollout until to get the perfect list. Think of it that way. Think of it in marketing terms. They didn't want to make the perfect enemy of the good. So they want to get going and get people to be able to participate. And then once they got a better list, be able to go back to people they hadn't been able to get to the first time.
Gotcha. Shay says, I never received a code to move forward with opting in or out. Kind of along the same lines.
So let me try to understand that. Can you get on, unmute yourself? Great.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm in a clinic. Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely. It's great. So I'm not familiar with the mechanics enough to say, when you say you didn't get the code to opt in or out, I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah, so when you go online, and I have a mask on too, I'm in a clinic, they say that you have to go on the website and you have to get a code in order to just to move forward with opting in and opting out. My sister, who owns a business, a couple other business owners have still not received the code yet.
And we were told by Glenn that they were sent out by postcard, I think, to the businesses, but so many of our businesses never received anything. And I think he mentioned you can call into their office and get a code to be able to proceed.
That's correct.
Well, let me make a suggestion, Christy. If you could do this, if you could write these problems up.
Sure.
And email them to Glenn and to me. That would be a big help.
Absolutely. Yeah, we will do that. And I know, Scott, you had brought this up to me. Do you want to unmute and ask your questions?
Not really, but yeah. Yeah, so I was never quite clear. But again, like most people, a lot of people in this company, I never received anything from Ramsey, so not sure about the whole opt-in, opt-out, employee versus employer, who has to do what actions need to be taken, is this actually in place? What are the penalties? Are there penalties? I don't really, I can't really wrap my head around it. I guess you really haven't taken time to try to do stuff.
I couldn't understand most of that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it was a little hard to hear you, Scott. I don't know if you want to try to repeat that.
Check my microphone.
I think you're breaking up a little, but from what I heard, and you sent a comment about this, you weren't sure, when the program was in place, who has to opt in or out, and you're not sure if you're supposed to have a plan in place for employees or supposed to do something else.
Okay, I mean, I can explain the simple version of that, but I would put these concerns on paper and get them to Glenn and me. Mm-hmm. If you already have a payroll deduction savings plan for your employees, you don't have to do anything other than tell SDAT that when you filed your form, which just was like 2 weeks ago with SDAT, the annual form. That's all you have to do.
Okay.
If you don't have a plan and want a plan, you have to sign up with Maryland Saves. You have to do that proactively. And then your employees are automatically enrolled unless they opt out. The opt-out is only for the employees. The opt-in is for the employer. If you don't have a plan and don't want to opt into Maryland Saves, you don't have to, but you'll still keep paying $300 a year to SDAT for registration. Anybody who has a plan or joins Maryland Saves by that deadline doesn't have to pay $300. So the idea is to make it in the employer's interest to do that. It'll help their employees at no cost to the employer, and they save $300.
Right. And Scott, one thing I did hear you say was what the penalties are and how that rolls out. I do know when we had Glenn on, he kind of alluded to, don't worry about the penalties right now because of the rollout and how it went. They're not trying to assess people fees immediately. if they miss something. Is that your take on it as well, Senator?
Well, there are no penalties in the law. I don't know what that's referring to.
Okay.
But again, put this on paper, get it to Glenn, get back responses on paper to the specific questions to be sure we're all clear.
We will, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, moving on. We have time for another question or two, if anyone would like to unmute themselves.
All the questions have been answered by Andrew. That's pretty impressive.
Don't give me too much credit, Senator.
Well, maybe I'll do this if I could take a couple of minutes because I've got to get off at 3:00 sharp.
Yeah, sure.
Andrew talking about workforce, and I do a lot of work on workforce issues and appreciate the Chamber's support and the business community's ideas. The big thing that you'll be hearing more about that I'd love the Chamber's perspectives on and members' perspectives on is we have, as we all know, shortages in all kinds of workforce areas. But there some big buckets are healthcare, IT, logistics, and actually higher levels of management in industries like hospitality and hospitality. And then and Andrew mentioned childcare, tremendous ones there. So to take a macro approach to this and to do it in a way that is financially feasible for businesses, when we passed what was called the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, which is this big education reform plan we passed a couple of years ago, we set the goal that by 2031, at least 45% of Maryland high school graduates will have completed the high school level of a registered apprenticeship, which means that they would start working part-time while they're juniors and seniors in high school. I mean, a lot of kids do that now, but very few of them do it on career tracks that are in great demand. So most kids, and we know this from common sense and survey work, they mostly work in restaurants or hotels or childcare, but not in a structured way to get them the training they need to move up. So we've put together, and it was just signed today, actually, that's why I'm in Annapolis, a bill to set up what we call Apprenticeship 2030 Commission. That'll be made up of business leaders, labor leaders, legislators, executive branch people, to develop a plan for how we get from the 12,000 apprentices we have today in the state in all fields to the 60,000 that we need by 2031. It's doable. They do it in other countries. And the Labor Department has already been working with a variety of industries, creating apprenticeships starting in high school. And I'll give you an example, which is in the public sector, but it's eminently transferable, I think, to the private sector. Everybody's got buildings they need to maintain. There's a tremendous shortage of building maintenance folks. And so to get the ball rolling in Prince George's County, the Prince George's school system set up a building maintenance apprenticeship. So the kids, as juniors, they take their first round of construction-related courses, which we already have those in the schools. They start working part-time for the building maintenance department during the year. They work full-time during the summer. So instead of the kid getting a job at a restaurant, they're getting a job in their career with training they've gotten in school to do building maintenance. They go to their senior year, they finish up their academics, they go to the second level of professional training in building maintenance. When they graduate, they go to work full-time in the building maintenance department of the Prince George's school system, and then have 2 more levels of classroom training that they take at the community college. That can be done with nursing. That can be done with IT. That can be done. We actually have a proposal to do that with our teacher shortage. So you'll be hearing a lot more about this. And I'd love for people to think in their own industry how we can make such an effort really helpful to you and your workforce shortages and others in the community. So I wanted to mention that before I had to check out.
That's great. And we are happy, the Chamber's happy to help spread the word about that and get people thinking about apprenticeships and other types of industries we don't traditionally think about.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. Well, I know it's almost 3 o'clock, and a bunch of people had to roll off at 3, including Andrew. So I just want to thank you all for joining us today, and a big thank you to Andrew for presenting and the Senator for being with us as well. We appreciate your support, and we will follow up with everyone who registered for this program today with a recording in case you want to rewatch it. And of course, you can always send me or any of our staff members emails and questions, and we will try to get the answers to you. So thank you again, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thanks.